Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Quest for Truth. We've kind of wrapped up the church. Obviously, like I said previously, much more could be said, but I think we covered the essential parts and to really have a firm foundation of what the church is. And now, moving forward, we're going to be talking about the last piece of theology that we have to cover, and that is what's referred to as eschatology, which is the end times, the study of the end. And we're going to start today by talking about something that's not really actually an eschatological idea, but we're going to be talking about heaven today. And the reason that I say it's not really eschatological is because it's not really an end time thing. It exists currently, and it has existed, as we'll talk about. So it's not a piece of the end, but it kind of leads well into a look at the end times. And so we're going to get started by kind of talking about what heaven is. Now, heaven was created by God. In Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. And he created heavens, both the space in which like earth and everything would be, but also what's referred to as the third heaven, which is what we're talking about. And he created that, and he created the earth, and then it kind of focuses in on the earth. And so we'll kind of come back to that a little bit later, but we don't really know in that instance, like the creation of heaven, we don't really know that. We just know that it was created. Now, we do know from some other passages in Scripture a little bit more about heaven. So in Revelation chapter 4, verses 1 through 4, says this: "After these things I looked, and behold, a door standing open in heaven, and the first voice which I heard, like the sound of a trumpet, speaking with me, said, 'Come up here, and I will show you what must take place after these things.' Immediately I was in the Spirit, and behold, a throne was standing in heaven, and one sitting on the throne. And he who was sitting was like a jasper stone, and a sardius in appearance, and there was a rainbow around the throne, like an emerald in appearance. Around the throne were 24 thrones, and among the thrones I saw 24 elders sitting clothed in white garments and golden crowns on their head." Now we could continue, but I don't think there's any need, because in this we see that this is the throne room of God. This is where God rules from. It's where his throne is. He's, like we talked about before, God is omnipresent, which means he is everywhere. He is fully in all places at all times, but this is where he rules from. Isaiah 66:1 says that heaven is God's throne and earth is his footstool. So this is the location of which that he rules from. Now, we know that Jesus, when he died, he ascended to heaven, and we know that, and that he is seated in heaven at the right hand of God the Father. So that is where Jesus is. Now, it's also the idea of the throne room of God also makes it the place of God's judgment, where he judges. And as we go through again, when we talk about the two judgments that we'll see, this is where I believe that they take place. This is where he rules. This is where he judges. And this is, kind of one of the obvious aspects, and I think that this is the one most known thing about heaven, but heaven is the place where Christians go when they die. And we see this, there's a couple of passages that were written by Paul to the Corinthians, but we're going to look at 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verses 6 through 8, when I get there. It says this, "Therefore, being always of good courage, and knowing that while we are at home in the body, we are absent from the Lord, for we walk by faith, not by sight. We are of good courage, I say, and prefer rather to be absent from the body and to be at home with the Lord." Like I said, the Lord, Christ Jesus, is in heaven. And so when Paul says that we want to be absent from the body and to be present with the Lord, what he's saying is that when we die here, when we leave this body behind, that we go and be with Jesus in heaven. And, and that kind of brings up another idea too, which is talked about in earlier in 2 Corinthians 5, the idea of, people talk about a heavenly body. What does that mean? Or do we have bodies in heaven? And I don't think that that's really the important thing to focus on. 1 Corinthians chapter 15 talks about that we have to leave behind the perishable and put on the imperishable. And so, but it also talks about having a spiritual body. And so, does that mean that we just have a spiritual body? Our spirit is just kind of in some form? I don't know. And that would be something to maybe look further into, but that's not really, how we are in heaven isn't, I don't think, the important thing, but what we're doing in heaven is important. And when you think about looking more into Revelation, worship is happening in heaven. We will worship God, and throughout time. And so before I look at kind of what I think is the most important thing that I want to talk about with heaven, I want to kind of back up a little bit, because in Luke chapter 16, Jesus tells this it's either a story or a parable. Some people argue for one or the other, but it's the story of Lazarus and the rich man. And, the rich man is wealthy, and Lazarus is poor and a beggar at the gate of the rich man. And they both die. And Lazarus was saved and believed in Jesus and went to this place called Abraham's bosom. So I briefly want to talk about this. What is Abraham's bosom? What does that mean? Well, before Jesus died, there was the promise of the Messiah, the Old Testament one who would come and save his people. And kind of thinking about it in our terms, when we think about that, we have this idea of like that we're saved, we're sanctified, and we're glorified. It's kind of putting into those words, it's the idea that glorification was promised in the Old Testament, but it hadn't yet been fulfilled. It was only fulfilled when Jesus died on the cross. And so before, when Jesus died, there was still that idea that the promise was made but not fully kept yet. And so Old Testament saints were not in heaven, actually. They were in what's referred to as Abraham's bosom, or like with Abraham, in this place that, if you look into, which we might look into a little bit more next week, but if you look into, Luke chapter 16, there's this place of what's called in Sheol, which is death, and there's kind of these two parts of it. One is hell that we'll look at next week, and the one we're talking about is Abraham's bosom, and there's a kind of a window between the two. They could talk back and forth, but there was no possible way that you could go between the two, even at that point. And so we kind of see that picture. And then when Christ died, he fulfilled the promise that was made to glorify, right, and to bring about the ability for the Old Testament saints, as much as all of the saints, to be with God in heaven. And we see that in two different passages. We see that in Ephesians 4:8-10. Therefore it says, when he ascended on high, he led captive a host of captives, and he gave gifts to men. Now this expression, he ascended, what does it mean except that he also had descended into the lower parts of the earth? He who descended is himself also he who ascended far above all the heavens, so that he might fill all things. And then also 1 Peter 3:18-20, that says, for Christ also died for sins once for all, the just for the unjust, so that he might bring us to God, having been put to death in the flesh, but also made alive in the Spirit, in which also he went, and made proclamation to the spirits now in prison. For once were disobedient, when the patience of God kept waiting in the days of Noah during the construction of the ark, in which a few, that is 8 persons, were brought safely through the water. Now, both of these passages paint this picture of that when Christ was died on the cross, he descended into Abraham's bosom, where all the saints were. Some people think that what that's saying is he went to hell for his sins, but Jesus didn't commit any sins, and the sins that he took upon us were paid for in his death. So when he died, essentially, the moment after he died, every sin everywhere was paid for. So there was no sin left to be paid for on him, and so he descended into this place where all the New Testament saints were, Abraham's bosom, and he gathered the saints together, and he took them with him when he ascended to heaven, or as he ascended to heaven. Now, again, the one says that in 1 Peter it says that he preached to hell, and that either means that when he took the saints, the people in hell could see this happen, and now that they maybe had some amount of hope to grasp, but now it was gone, or maybe he spoke, as we saw with Lazarus and the rich man. He might have spoken something in condemnation of those who were in hell. But the last thing I want to look at, I think that is really important to keep in mind as we continue looking at the end times, is that heaven is temporary. We often think of heaven as being something that's going to be around, that we'll live in heaven forever, but that's not the case, and we'll see that as we go through the study. Now, if you think back to the beginning when I talked about heaven was created, well, God created heaven and earth, but he prepared the earth for man. He made land, and he separated the land from the water, and he put trees and all of this stuff, and he created animals so that man could live on earth. And that hasn't changed. That's still the plan. And as we go through, we'll see God's plan for renewing the earth so that once again we can live on the earth in a renewed state. So I'll see you next week.